Okay, folks. Well, I'll kick off. This is panel 2, so we're going to be focusing on the occulture of war. And I'll just take a little bit of time to introduce to you the two speakers this morning. The first is Owen Davies, Professor of Social History at the University of Hertfordshire. Much of his work concerns the belief in witchcraft, magic, ghosts, spectrality, and popular medicine. He also has interests in heritage and public history. He's currently a co-investigator for the AHRC Everyday Lives in War Engagement Centre and on the Leverhulme Trust-funded project Emotions, Identity and the Supernatural 1300 to 1900. His most recent works are the Oxford Illustrated History of Witchcraft and Magic 2017 and the Wellcome Trust-funded Open Access book with Francesca Matteoni, Executing Magic in the Modern Era, Criminal Bodies and the Gallows in Popular Medicine. His book on supernatural beliefs during the First World War will be published by OUP later this year. And we've also got Henrik Bogdan today as well, who's Professor in History of Religions at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. He's the author of Western Esotericism and Rituals of Initiation, editor of Brother Kerwin, Brother Crowley, A Correspondence, and co-editor of Aleister Crowley and Western Esotericism, which I have in my office next door. Occultism in a Global Perspective, Sexuality and New Religious Movements, Handbook on Freemasonry, Western Esotericism in Scandinavia, and he's also the editor of the Oxford Studies in Western Esotericism. So first of all, I'll hand over to Owen.
Okay, no, thank you. So yes, as Andrew said, this kind of merges two interests currently from different research projects. One, my ongoing interest in the supernatural generally, and two, the grinding on of the centenary of the First World War. We're now in our, whatever it is, 4th to 5th year of these 5 national engagement centres of the First World War. And these were funded by the HRC to the tune of about £5 million. They are not research centres, they are, as they say, public engagement centres where we're meant to be challenging traditional narratives about the war and understandings, etc. And one of my strands on this was to explore in much greater depth and in more elaboration the ways in which religion and the supernatural and the occult were influenced by the First World War and the degree to which they influenced people's understanding of the war at the time. And I'm going to kind of try to tease apart 4 main strands here, and I'm going to focus a bit on psychical research during the war, and a bit on spiritualism during the First World War, some on Theosophy, and then something which has been very neglected, which is the New Thought movement and a kind of occult power in the war. But I'll start off by giving a bit of historic context, and very much I am a social historian, and this is my approach to this sorts of material. And when the war broke out, it was perceived at the time to be a modern war. This was, in a sense, the apotheosis of modernity. A war involving planes, a war involving tanks, a war involving zeppelins, a war involving mustard gas. These were all signs of a scientific war, and it was talked about at the time in these very terms of modernity and science. And so expressions of what might be deemed at the time as irrational beliefs were of great interest to kind of several burgeoning areas of academia at the time. So as the war is breaking out, psychology as a discipline is coming into its own as an academic discipline. It had been kind of born in Germany, but by the time of the war, the Americans had really started to dominate the early academic discipline of psychology. And the war in Europe to American psychologists was a fantastic laboratory. Obviously, they're not involved until 1917. They can see themselves as neutral academics, understanding what was going on, this extraordinarily scientific war, and yet what they could see in various expressions, whether it was the perceived boom in spiritualism, the perceived resort to magic, charms and talismans, as some sort of atavistic return to the primitive, and how to match this idea of the first scientific war, the first modern global war, with what seemed its apparent effect on the population was of great interest, as I say, to American psychologists. And a number of American psychologists actually participated in the ambulance corps early on in the war as a means to try and get a sense of what it was like to be in the trenches. What was it that led men to religion, to faith, to resort to the magical, resort to the, particularly to charms, talismans, and sort of what we would call the more occult expressions of religion at this time. And they talked about it in these terms. They talk about Britain, they talk about France as, you know, the terrible effect of the stress and anxiety on the war. And this is how they obviously couch it, because it's how war I try and understand the impact of war on individual psychologists today. It's stress and anxiety, but this stress and anxiety was collectively, in a sense, a harmful return to a kind of irrationalism, which will have long-lasting influences on the British and French populations after the war, in terms of the idea of progressive intellectual modern thought. So it's a laboratory from the American perspective. German psychology carries on, and German academics get involved explicitly and engage with the military about testing the psychology and anxiety of German soldiers on frontline warfare, and trying to understand once again how it impacts upon their beliefs on their faith at this time. So the psychologists have this interest in exploring this apparent, you know, this extraordinary juxtaposition between modernity and individual and collective return to a more primitive understanding or primitive actions and reactions at this time. At the same time, the folklorists on the continent are interested in what's happening. They're interested in what they call the recrudescence of the supernatural during the war. And again, for the same reasons, the spiritualism identified return to talismans, return to all forms of avoidance rituals, or what they term superstition. It's obviously a term that historians today are very reluctant to use, but was obviously widely used at the time to describe all these things, a return to the superstitious. And so folklorists are interested in war superstition. And particularly from French and Swiss and Austria, a kind of a new genre of folklore develops, which is called war folklore. It never takes off in Britain. There's practically no war folklorist or war folklore going on. It's a very different approach and understanding to the war that takes place. But in France and Switzerland, a lot of research is being done during the war. It's a laboratory again. A lot of this is about things about communication, about rumour. There's lots of books published even during the war of rumour studies. And some of this engages with notions of prophecy and a lot of the prophetic literature that develops at this time during the war across all the combatant countries. One of the key texts, perhaps the very first study, it is the very first study of the First World War and superstition to the First World War, was actually published in 1918 by the French folklorist and psychologist Alfred Doza. So actually, right as the war is happening, they're actually publishing academic material to understand this stuff. Not in Britain. This is very much happening in America and then on the continent. I mean, the folklorist approach is different to the psychologists. They're interested in the same material. They're looking at rumour. They're looking at the songs and the argot, the slang of soldiers and how it develops. They're looking at how different cultures and classes are brought together in the trenches and what impact that has on communication and the development of new folkloric ideas, new folkloric expressions. But unlike the psychologists, most of them are couched in that classic model of early folklore, which is survivals, the interest in survivals. And they're looking for elements which kind of tell us something about the early states, the age of magic in an early Fraserian anthropological model. And they're looking about these sorts of expressions and why they have come out, why the war and the conditions of the war bring back and bring to the fore survivals which modern society, they thought, in education had pretty much suppressed. So for them, is this a veneer of a society which actually hasn't progressed? Or is it just some sort of relic that amongst certain ignorant, uneducated soldiers comes out, but for the intelligentsia is clearly something which is to be dismissed, is not a part of warfare. So there's a whole class element here in terms of the study, and quite a lot of the war folklore that takes place is actually in Italy, and a number of folklorists actually go into the trenches collecting material on this matter, and they're particularly interested in the way in which, for example, southern Italians are considered to be backward and unintelligent compared to the northern Italians, and so there's a lot of this sort of identity and sort of, you know, ethnographic sort of racism that takes place. And obviously for some of the Austrian folklorists at this time, they've got lots of prisoner of war camps, and they're looking at the captured Slavic soldiers, for example, and analysing them from a very much an anthropological point of view as well. So this is a kind of a laboratory to understand the supernatural, superstition, the occult, and what it means in a modern society at this time. As I say, British anthropology and folklore practically ignore the war in terms of studying it. It's kind of, there's the president of the society, Marrett at the time, through most of the war, basically hardly says anything in his presidential addresses about the war. He only vaguely touches upon and recognises what's going on the continent as a war folklore, but otherwise is basically saying we don't have time to go around studying this, we've got to focus on the war effort itself. This is not the moment to be engaging in academic study. And even British anthropologists, again, are reluctant to get involved in the same sorts of studies that are happening amongst combatant countries elsewhere on this. But there was also a political agenda behind all this as well. Propaganda is huge. The First World War is one of the great crucibles of modern propaganda techniques and understanding and development of methodologies of propaganda at this time. And the label of superstition becomes a classic thing that you label the other with. So you'll get the German press and the Austrian press saying, the Americans are so superstitious, the British are so superstitious. The Austrian press will print things from the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail will say something as London is infested with fortune tellers at the moment. And the Austrian press go, look at them, look at the British, look at them. God, we're going to win this war because look at them, they're resorting to fortune tellers now. How foolish is that? They must be really on their knees if they have to resort to the occult, to magic, to kind of support them. So it becomes a very explicit propaganda tool. Works both ways. There's huge amounts of propaganda about the ways in which the Kaiser is superstitious. The Kaiser carries a lucky four-leaf clover. The Kaiser carries charms on him, etc. What a fool. We found Austrian soldiers that carry bats' wings on them to protect them. Ha, ha, ha. Clearly they're on their knees again. So it's a two-way propaganda battle in which the occult and magic gets used for that. And perhaps one of the biggest expressions of how that is done in terms of, again, feeding back into the anthropological notions of survivalism and the return to primitive and primitive beliefs, was the German money-making war effort charitable exercise, which is called Nagelfiguren, which were nail figures, often giant figures, and they could be of lions and animals, but they were also submarines. But the biggest one, which was about, I can't remember, it was about 80 foot high, wooden statue of Hindenburg, Great General Hindenburg, and it was in Berlin. And it was set up, and what they would do is across Germany, people would be charged to buy a silver nail or a gold nail or a bronze nail, whatever, different prices, and you would go up to it as a member of the public and you would nail it in. So you donated to charity, and so these figures would gradually become these great iron or metal figures from wood. And this was looked upon by French and written about in anthropological journals in 1915, 1916 by French anthropologists. And they said, look at the Germans. Incredible, look at this. And they said, look, you compare this to the sort of fetishes we find in Africa, nail fetishes, which were being studied at that time. They go, look, they've reverted back, to how they see to kind of an African primitivism as understood by anthropologists at the time. So you've got the French anthropologists saying, look what the Germans, look what the Kaiser has done to the German people. They've brought them back to a superstitious age where they're now nailing wooden figures, nailing these things. And there was some more subtle reflection upon this, and some were saying, hold on, actually, if you go to Brittany, you'll find nailing trees, for example. We find this everywhere. But it all gets merged into the kind of propagandist war effort one way or another, and the Germans are clearly, reverting back to their primitive state, as we always knew the Germans would, So it's couched in those terms. So that's the kind of background context to how about all the stuff that is being debated at the time in academic circles, in propagandist political circles, religious circles, etc. So it's an ongoing debate, where everything gets put into a melting pot. And this has long-term consequences in our understanding of the occult in the First World War. Because, well, one, in the sense that there's actually very little written about occultism during the First World War. Spiritualism, for example, there's lots of books on spiritualism, and one of the authors here, and who probably hopefully will back me up on this, but there's actually although a lot of books cover the period across the First World War into the 1930s and 40s from its origins, very few actually have looked in detail at the First World War itself, those 1914 to 1918 period. And very little as work has been done on Theosophy in that small period, etc., etc. These things become broader histories, and everyone notes that there apparently was a great boom in belief in Theosophy and the occult and during the war, but no one's really tested it. No one's really looked at the details of this. And too much emphasis and too much weight has been put upon 2 or 3 well-known First World War authors. In other words, authors of the First World War who have written a bit about the occult and spiritualism but aren't actually academics who study spiritualism. One of those is Jay Winter, very well known, writes excellent books. One, Sights of Memory is a classic understanding, quite pioneering work of the First World War. And before him, Paul Fussell wrote a very groundbreaking book in the 1970s about memory in the First World War. And both Fussell and Jay Winter really stamped their authority on First World War history. In terms of religion, not in military terms, that's another genre, but in terms of the understanding of society and belief during the war. But the problem with both Fussell and Winter is they've taken for granted all that stuff I've been talking about each side accusing each other of a growth of spiritualism, a growth of belief, and taking it at face value. And so basically what they've said is that, yes, there is a boom of spiritualism and interest in the occult during the First World War, and they talk about it in terms of, quote, an avalanche of unmodernity, a massive growth in the superstitious, a kind of a brief moment in societal progress of backwardness, and really what they're basing that on is all that kind of literature that's coming out at the time from psychologists, from folklorists, from anthropologists, and particularly from the critiques of spiritualism, but also the spiritualist movement itself, which is very keen to promote that it's growing during the First World War. So our current understanding of this is really based on received wisdom rather than a real in-depth study of what's going on. And that's what, the second part of the talk is just to unpick some of this, because one of the problems with Jay Winter and Fussell is everything gets lumped together. So when Jay Winter says there's been a big growth in spiritualism, you look deeper. When he's talking about spiritualism, he's talking about psychical research. He's talking about aspects of popular magic, popular charms. That's not spiritualism at all. His psychical research, there are lots of psychical research who, absolutely disagree with the idea of spiritualism. But he just conflates everything. Everything gets conflated as though there's one kind of broad spiritualist boom, spiritualist movement, which you can just encompass it. And it's not. It's far more complex than that, far more complex. And the other problem with this is, of course, that First World War historians are looking at the First World War. They're not historians of the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th century. I am. And what I see during the First World War is very much a continuation of popular belief in these things. There isn't some great hiatus and a great boom. Yes, as I'll tease out, there are interesting ways in which the First World War impacts and influences our understanding, or people's understanding at the time, or engagement with the occult. But in the totality of 400 years, it's not that much different. And I'll perhaps just end by saying what happens in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, because again, it's a kind of a continuum, and you can go back to the 1850s and the rise of spiritualism and look at it in the same way. If you just looked at spiritualism, you go, this is a groundbreaking thing. But no, there's a whole tale of spiritualist history right back into the 18th century. These things can't be just compartmentalized. But that's the challenge of the way in which the First World War history has dominated the study of the occult and not the other way around on these things. So one of the things I've engaged with, part of this, is to try and tease apart what are the different things going on in the war, what are the different responses of these different movements and organisations during the war, and what does it tell us about both the First World War and its influence on popular understanding, popular expressions of the occult, and in what ways it doesn't. So I'll start off with psychical research. And again, there's a general kind of thought, or if you ask general public or whatever about psychical research, there was a big boom in this period. Now, this isn't true. If you look at the records of the Society for Psychical Research in this country and the committee meetings from 1914 to 1918, they're desperate for material which might prove some of their findings. The key thing, the problem here with people's understanding of the Society for Psychical Research is they associate it so closely with spiritualism. And in fact, during the war years, it wasn't spiritualism and contacting the dead soldiers that was of particular interest to most of them. Quite a number of them had no truck with spiritualism whatsoever at this time. That wasn't to them. It had finished. They've been through all that. By the war, the main emphasis of many members of the Society for Psychical Research and scientists was in clairvoyance and thought transference. This is the key. This is what they think they might get out of the war in a scientific way, by studying all those cases and accounts whereby soldiers on the battlefront have appeared to their loved ones at the last minute before death. And they think if they can gather enough of these cases, it may be finally a really good proof that clairvoyance, thought transference, actually happens, that they can scientifically prove this by collecting so much evidence. So many people are dying in such a concentrated way. Surely thousands of people are going to be reporting these experiences, but they're not. And you look at the journals of scientific psychical research, 1915, they go, we're really disappointed. We've only really got 3 cases that we think are verifiable enough to actually print in the journal. 1916, really disappointing again. They've reflected upon actually the war to date, 2 years on, we've only printed 5 or 7 cases, which we think, this is out of, obviously hundreds of thousands of people dying. So they themselves as a society are disappointed with what they thought might be the great revelation that the war will give us this evidence of transference of thought power. But there are certain aspects of the the psychical research community which are ardent spiritualists, which are occultists. It's a very divided movement, and it goes on to become even more divided just after the war. But there is an occult wing to the Society for Psychical Research, and they see, some of them at least, see the war in a different way. They don't see it as a laboratory for testing in a scientific manner. They think that as occultists and as explorers of the psychic, that they should actually be doing something. They should be intervening in the war on the side of the British, on the side of good. And so we get various attempts to try and use psychical powers to influence the war itself at this time. One of those is a theosophist, and I'll come back to theosophy. A.P. Sinnott, quite a well-known character, is constantly churning out stuff in the Occult Review and other sorts of publications at this time. And Sinnott writes in 1914, what we need to do is if we just got the population of London to concentrate for 10 minutes on the defeat of Germany, it would be the equivalent of battalions of new soldiers for the Allies on this case. So he puts out a call out there for this. He's not alone in this. There's a letter in the Times from a woman from a soldier's daughter, who again calls in the Times that we should gather together to defeat Germany through thought. And also in Italy, an architect and occultist named Vittorio Galli publishes a 1960 pamphlet called Guerra Telepatica, in which again he's calling for a collective psychic union to defeat Germany and Austria in this. And this gets a bit of traction in occult circles at this time. And it leads to one of my favourite organisations, which comes out of the war, which is called the Householders' War League of Thought in 1960. It's a fantastic title. And as it self-proclaimed, it aimed to tap into the mighty energies of organised collective thought to bring about peace through overwhelming victory. And it was explained in a journal called the Herald of the Star, which actually is an offshoot part of the Theosophical movement in Britain, the Herald of the Star journal. And it puts out adverts across allied countries in Australia and New Zealand, in America and Canada and Britain at this time in May 1916. I'll just read it out to you. Every householder in the empire is invited to gather the inmates of his house together for a few minutes daily for silent, concentrated thought directed to the helping of the power of good. Each one throwing all his thought and energy on the side of right so as to bring this war to a successful close as soon as possible. Where desired, the few silent minutes could open with these words: we ask that the divine will shall find in us clean and deep channels through which it may deign to flow. If hundreds of thousands, either householders or singly, who are unable to be at the front would help in this practical way, we should create an effective force. It flops badly. Really, I mean, it's a kind of an idea which, as I say, is born out of a number of ideas that are going around. It's organised by Order of the Star of the East, which is a British sort of component which I'll talk about, Krishnamurti, Theosophy, and it spreads across different circles. But there's no sense in which anyone in hundreds of thousands of households are taking up this challenge to all collectively fight the German Axis powers on this basis. But there are those who think there's other ways in which they could help. So in France, for example, there's a couple of psychical research who investigate with some well-known clairvoyants about whether they can detect where German artillery and battery units are through telepathy and conduct experiments. There was one by, I can't remember his name now, but with one medium, and he reckoned that she sheared through collective thinking, had managed to kind of locate where some zeppelins had been hiding out, etc. But there was quite a lot of scepticism even within the psychical research movement about this sort of thing in France. Basically, there was a fairly isolated case. At one of the conferences in 1917 of the French psychical movement, they basically say telepathy, clairvoyance is just too vague. We just don't know enough about it at the moment to be able to clearly use this as a military technique, a military tool at this time. There are others who think that the psychics, rather than going on the psychic offensive, they find that the kind of idea of a psychic offensive is very offensive, because quite a lot of psychical research, particularly those with a theosophical and spiritualist bent, think they should actually have a movement for a psychical peace. In other words, you're not praying for the defeat of the enemy, you're actually praying and using your thought power and your psychical energies to bring about world peace at this time. And this leads to another movement which meets up on August 1940. So quite a lot of stuff is really active right early on in the war and then kind of dissipates a bit. And there was a meeting on the 27th of August at the Occult Club in Piccadilly Place. Not many people know about the Occult Club. It's a fairly short-lived entity at this time. And its leading light was, some of you may know, is Linda Aff Haggerby, who's a kind of a very interesting character, one of the founders of anti-vivisection movement, very influential mover in spiritualist circles and theosophical circles. Fascinating character, really been understudied. Anyway, she's kind of one of the prime movers in this little grouping that came together. So they meet at the Occult Club, and they're quite a disparate bunch. One of them is Frederick L. Rawson, I'll come back to it briefly, who was a Christian Scientist who set up his own kind of cult, basically, thought power cult in this country. And they meet up, and they have a big debate about about setting up what's called an occultist peace union. So this meeting actually is there to define what this occultist peace union would have, and it would have a constitution, and this whole movement would be dedicated to ending the war through global peace, through psychical means at this time. It's interesting to pick out some of the debate that takes place at this meeting, because it gives you a kind of indication about how they perceive themselves and how they think others perceive them. So Rawson, who's a bit of a dodgy character, and I'll come back to it if I've got time, he says, "I don't like the term occult. You know, if we shouldn't call ourselves the occultist peace union." As he said, the cult is too closely associated with black magic in the popular mind, and it would detract from the proposed union's aims. And a couple of other members at the meeting expressed the same thing. One of those was a medium called Mrs. Gaskell, who comes up instead with the idea of the Rose and Lily Peace League, because its poetic appeal would stir the spiritual nature of the people. This was dismissed fairly quickly. Linda Aff Haggerby gets pretty much her own right, and they set up the Occultist Peace Union. Again, it goes absolutely nowhere beyond the small grouping. But these efforts are taking place within the occult movement. The Spiritualists, and I guess a lot of these people are spiritualists, can be Theosophists, can be psychical research. They kind of, it's like a Venn diagram into sections here. They don't always necessarily all meet up. But Spiritualists, although there's seen to be a boom in spiritualism in the period, there isn't in any definable way. Spiritualist churches do not see a boom in membership during the war years. What is actually happening, and I don't have time to go, this is kind of a different issue, is that the press and commentators are confusing fortune tellers and mediums, or mediums who are fortune tellers. There is not a huge boom during the war years of people going to mediums to speak to the spirits of their dead loved ones on the trenches. And this is very much, that understanding one which Jay Winter and others have propounded is very much based on the focus on people like Arthur Conan Doyle, Oliver Lodge, etc., who were doing that. But the vast majority of people going to mediums were looking for divination techniques. They're not asking to speak to the dead. So it's a different part of the history of this, which I don't have time to go into. So there is no spiritualist boom in terms of church, spiritualist church membership. In fact, some of them decline during the war. But there are spiritualists during the war. There's a strong pacifist streak in the spiritualist movement. So there are people who are refusing to serve in the British Army at this time, and they go before the military tribunals that are set up in 1916 with conscription, and they state their spiritualist cause, and quite a lot of them are socialists as well. And so actually what their view of the war is very much tainted by the politics rather than the spiritualism at this time. And so the main actual spiritualist sort of approach to the war, if you're not a pacifist, and quite a lot of spiritualists were fighting the war and died in the war, even though they might have been fairly reluctant about it. A lot of them served in the ambulance corps, for example. But again, a number of historians like Jay Winter have kind of suggested that spiritualism grows in the trenches because of the pressures and anxieties and all the death around them. Again, absolutely no proof. Is a few little examples here and there. Most spiritualists, when you look at the letters coming back, saying, I don't really talk about my spiritualism here. My spiritualism is a private thing. I'm not going out recruiting. Spiritualism is not an evangelical movement. While the Christian church, while the Catholic Church and the various Protestant denominations are over themselves trying to, in evangelical terms during the war, the spiritualist movement is not at this time. And on the home front, the main sort of effort that the spiritualists think that they can engage with the war in a pacifistic way is to work with the spirit world to help all the dead spirits on the battlefield going over to the other side. And so they're kind of like a humane spiritualist taxi service. And you get these reports in the spiritualist journals of saying, we had a lovely seance the other day with my wife, who's the medium, and we had a lovely Indian officer, lovely gentleman, who was very thankful about how our spirit guide had helped him after he'd just been obliterated on the battlefield and move over to the other side. And so we get lots of spiritualists who feel they're contributing to the war effort by working through their spirit guides to help all these spirits over, and to supporting doctor spirits. So those spirits who had been doctors in real life were really valuable because they not only understood the physical conditions of the dead and wounded on the battlefield, but also their psychical conditions, because they're on the other side. So they were really valued, and so quite a lot of mediums are saying, let's pull together, let's try and support these doctors, and let's support all sides in this sort of movement at this time. So that's that. Theosophical movement, again, a lot of these people doing that sort of thing are Theosophists, but the Theosophists also have a bigger picture. They have very much a millenarian view of the war at this time. For them, this is the Great Awakening. The great teacher is going to come down. They can see this in terms of a Christian kind of analogies of Armageddon. And Charles Leadbetter, who had succeeded, after had the various battles with Annie Besant. We won't go into those details, but Leadbetter become a big force in the Theosophical movement in this country during the First World War. He's the one who brought over Krishnamurti, who's going to be the great new teacher. In 1911, he was living in Maidstone. So this great figure who's going to lead the world into a new world order was in Maidstone. In other words, Britain was going to be the centre of the new world order after the war. Fantastic. Apart from Krishnamurti himself quickly distances himself from this movement. But from a theosophical point of view, there was a branch of Theosophy which considered this as the cosmic battle between the White Lodge and the Black Lodge. Not all Theosophists agreed with this, but people like A.P. Sinnott and others argued that the founding of humanity was in Atlantis, which was founded, and the White Lodge looked over. It was a world of peace and harmony, and then there was a great flood. But all that time, a Black Lodge had been developing, drawing upon the psychical, harmful aspects of humanity. The Great Flood had kind of eradicated all that, but it had never gone away. And the First World War was the great reawakening of the Black Lodge in the guise of the Germans. And the Black Lodge, during the time of Atlantis and the Great Flood, the Black Lodge had been consigned to the spiritual plane. Now in the First World War, they were on the mundane plane. They were amongst us. This was the most dangerous period in the whole of humanity. The great battle must be between the White Lodge and the Good Lodge, and all Theosophists should be supporting the White Lodge, obviously. This caused problems for German Theosophists, as you can imagine. And there are a number of debates going on in American Theosophical journals, where there are lots of German Americans, and obviously British, French Americans as well, about, hold on, it's not so clear about that. So that's seen as kind of a cosmic battle at this time. But there's great hope. The war is a great hope. So they look at it quite differently. It's a cosmic hope rather than something about individual spiritualists and spiritual spirits and the afterlife. And finally, I'll just touch on the New Thought movement, which hasn't received much. And so, although Christian Science was one of the great outgrowths of the New Thought movement was by Phyllis Quimby in the 1850s, and the whole idea was that there was only God. God was everything. There was no real material world. You could think away the material world. You could cure disease by just thinking there is no disease. And we get pamphlets like How to Protect Our Soldiers by Christian scientist W.C. Leake in 1917, when he basically says, to put this in practical military terms, in case of danger from submarines and mines, realize there are no material submarines or mines. For all God's ideas are spiritual and perfect. So you just think away all harm. So if every soldier thought in a Christian Science way, there would be no war because no one would be harmed. There would be no tanks, there would be no guns, there would be no bullets. Everyone would be in one sort of cosmic psychical peace themselves. And various Christian scientists have various different offshoots. There's the Unity movement, which actually is evangelical in parts of the war, which again is preaching the idea there is no material world. I've looked at letters from Christian Scientist soldiers who are actually fighting. One of them goes, I've been through every single battle between 1914 and 1916. I've had trench foot, I've been knee deep in the trenches, I've been through Vimy Ridge, the whole lot. And he writes in and says, you know, my thought powers helped me through this. When mustard gas attacked, I just thought there was no mustard gas. And it went over me. Thank you so much, Christian Science. And then I obviously looked at his record, and he died 2 months later. So he'd been through all that, and he'd put all his faith in this, and then he was blown to bits in Eppie Wood. And I've come across another letters, and some that survived as well. But there's this great, again, personal investment that, yes, psychical thought power can save me. It's all, you know, the material is insignificant to the spiritual at this time. And just finally to end with Rawson, so I give time for some questions. Frederick Rawson, who'd been this Christian Scientist, part of the Occultist Peace Union, was a charlatan, really, who preyed upon this. And set up his own sort of movement in London and toured around parts of the country and peddling a booklet called Bulletproof Soldiers. He said and promoted that, you know, with my help, that all soldiers could protect themselves from bullets by just thought power, by just thinking there are no bullets and I cannot be hurt. And this became quite a sensation. The Daily Mail got onto him and investigated him and exposed him at this time. So there was a big public scandal, but it also helped promote this scandal about Rawson, helped promote him and helped promote the idea. So he carried on touring. And again, this kind of thought power movement led to one final element, which is a kind of, which is Pelmanism. I don't know if anyone's heard of Pelmanism, but Pelmanism, it kind of comes out, it becomes a secular form of thought power by the idea it's not so based on your spiritual and immaterial, but Pelmanism becomes a kind of series of mental exercises to protect you. And Pelmanism at the end of the war is widely promoted in military magazines, Catholic magazines. It becomes one of the classic successes of early marketing, of how to market, in a sense, a new religion, really, but in a sense, a secular religion. So you can see, you know, just to conclude, that when you start unpicking things, there's huge, complex, different things going on, and you can't just all encompass it on the idea of the occult, to be honest. During the First World War, spiritualism as the First World War historians. There's a whole load of different histories here of the way in which people are reacting in all sorts of ways, and I better end there. I'm taking up time. Okay.
That's great. Thank you.